Uh, Thank you very much, Himanshu, for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation and also for this space, which is a wonderful thing. And much of what I'll be talking about or sharing and then opening for discussion has to do with work I'm doing. So it's a wonderful space to try out ideas and invite comments, discussion, and so forth. So thank you for that. So I'll share my screen. I have a slide. It contains a lot of pictures and illustrations and so forth to really engage with the question and to also illustrate the question. So let me do that first. Let me share. You tell me if it is visible.
Yes.
Hmm?
Yes, it's
So
visible.
hmm. So as you can see, there are two topics, as it were, that we will be discussing today. And my title shows that. One is the question of history in Heidegger, and the question of boundaries or limitations, borders, and how the two go together. In the parentheses, in the brackets, I've also mentioned other. So we'll also be looking at how otherness fits into this story, and it will be a kind of an aim here to sort of make the point that otherness is a crucial aspect of the thought of the later Heidegger, especially. So, so, so that's what we will be doing. Now, I'll start my first slide. The first slide contains something uh, infuriating, and oh, I just wanted to say one thing. If Himanshu, if if anybody, so what we'll do is we'll first go through. I'll speak for, let's say, for 35 minutes or so, and then I'll open this up for questions and comments and discussion. But if you think that there is something that is important, or you want to make a point about something that I'm saying, you can raise your hand, and maybe Himansh, because I can't see anything from
I
here,
can
but
understand, no problem. So please
yeah.
raise your hands and we'll point out accordingly.
Yes. Okay. So this is the first slide is a provocative and slightly infuriating one. It contains two quotations, and the two quotations of the first slide kind of set the problematic which we will be dealing with in the rest of the slides. So the first quote comes from Levinas. Emmanuel Levinas was a student of Heidegger's, and he's also the great thinker of otherness, of the other. So this is a statement from Levinas in an interview. And all my references can all be found just below everything that I quote, so you can go and check them out further. Okay, so this is my first quotation. It says, Levinas says, I often say, although it's a dangerous thing to say publicly, that humanity consists of the Bible and the Greeks. All the rest can be translated. All the rest, all the exotic is dance, Levinas says. And when I first sort of read this quote, which this statement, which I now both hate and love, is to ask what's wrong with dancing. I mean, why is that somehow presented as a negative thing, as opposed to maybe thinking, because the Greeks are mentioned. And then I realized that had I said that to Levinas, Levinas would perhaps tell me that fine, that's fine. I mean, my not being offended by this statement about dance would not necessarily change the point that he's making, that the universal center is Western Europe, and the rest, as you can see, is all the exotic. Okay, so that's the first quotation. Now, the second quotation comes from a post colonial thinker, and his name is Hamid Dabashi. And this is a quote from his lecture, which he gave last year at SOAS, and it's titled "Where is World Philosophy and How is she doing?" And this is what Hamid Dabashi says. He says, "If I went to Plato and said, 'Mr. Plato, I am Persian,' he would know who I am, though he may not like me. But if Levinas went to Plato or Xenophon and said he is French, neither of them will have a clue who he is." Now, that's a wonderful, very interesting response by Dabashi to this very statement from Levinas, where Dabashi is trying to say that although it could be true that the humanity consists, even if it is true that humanity consists of the Bible and the Greeks, he says that may or may not be dangerous, whether publicly said or privately said. But what Dabashi takes offense to, or what he finds problematic, is the idea that somehow the Greeks say are an exclusive inheritance of Western Europe. And he is pointing to, of course, a long history throughout the Islamicate world of philosophy and thinking, which has used and translated and edited and studied Plato and other Greek thinkers, and in fact has also translated them and sent them to the West. So that's what Dabashi is saying in response to Levinas. Now, although I agree with Dabashi's point, and I see what he is trying to say, and I accept his position, and we will come at the very end to back to this position. But I also think that there is something that is being missed here, that we are going from Levinas very quickly to a response. I think that there is something in what Levinas is saying, although, like I said, I think it is wrong, but there is still some diagnostic value to what Levinas is saying. It is, if we can look at it as Eurocentric and be done with it. But I think that another way to look at it could be to say that maybe there is a diagnosis that Levinas is presenting. And this is where, in these two quotations and how they stand with each other, I think this is where Heidegger enters for me, and especially Heidegger's late thinking on technology. Because to Heidegger, and Heidegger also says in his 1955 lecture called "What is Philosophy?" that to say Western philosophy, according to Heidegger, is a tautology. He says that there is no other philosophy. There's only Western European philosophy. And the reason that he gives for that, and it's a wonderful point that he makes immediately, he says that only through Western metaphysics do we have something like the atomic age, or the age of the internet, or the age of technology, which is wrecking the planet. So what I think Heidegger and Levinas and these people are saying, at least in their diagnostic moment, as diagnosis, is to say that even as I'm using this platform, even as I'm using my computer, even as I'm using Google Meet in order to talk, and we are all together over here, even in this web in which we are, from a Heideggerian perspective, we are all implicated in a certain metaphysical history. And that metaphysical history, again from a Heideggerian perspective, and we can trouble that later, again from a Heideggerian perspective, that history is Western European, post-Cartesian, and so on and so forth. So although I agree with Dabashi, the answer, and I also am, not only in this one quotation, Dabashi's two very good books. One is his book, Can Non-Europeans Think? It's a very interesting study of how most of Western thought has been in many ways mediated through the Islamicate world, and also in his recent book, which he has written in 2021 is Europe and its shadows. It's a very interesting study of Europe as an image, as a metaphor, and how, according to him, that metaphor no longer persists. That Europe as a metaphor has been provincialized. But Heidegger, especially when he is talking about technology, would say that it's especially when there is dispersion and breaking of the master metaphor, it is especially then that technology has its most pernicious grab or grasp on us. So, these are the two quotations, and I think that with the intervention of Heidegger and his later thinking on technology, all something interesting emerges, as we will see. And like I said, although I'm on Dabashi's side on this, it's a much more complicated affair than that. Okay, so that's my problem. The problem is, yes, Dabashi is right, but still one has to make one's Purva Paksha here really stronger, right? So that's the thing. So that's my first slide of the problem. This is an image that I took from NASA's website. This is the image is called, it's itself titled the Earthrise, and the phenomenon that we see in front of us here is called the Earthrise. It was an image taken from the lunar surface through a satellite of the Earth rising, right, and across the lunar horizon. Now, I would invite you to actually take a good look at this picture, because something earth-shattering is happening over here. What is happening here is that the earth, the ground on which we are even right now standing and engaging in this conversation, the earth itself has become an image, has become a reproducible, reshareable through Google Meet image. The deeper thing that's happening philosophically is that the earth now requires my permission. The earth requires me, the subject, the post-Cartesian subject, to render it its sufficient reason, right? And so the earth is true. The truth of the earth depends on how it is calculated, how it is measured, how it is located in this vast and ever expansive universe. And the subject has become the ground on which the ground is now grounded, if you see that inversion, right? So that's what is so earth-shattering about this image. And at this level, Heidegger's insistence would be to say that what you're seeing right here in front of you through this image, whatever this image is representing, comes from a history of metaphysics, and this is the culmination of that history, and we are all implicated in that history, right? So that's what the image represents. Now, this image was seen by Heidegger. Heidegger was alive at that time. He died in 1976, and he saw this and other images of the earth, and he was asked about it in an interview which he did in 1966, and this is what he had to say about this very image that we are looking at. He said, and you can find this is one of the more famous interviews of Heidegger. This is the interview where he says, "Only a God can save us." This is the Spiegel interview. He says, "I was shocked when a short time ago I saw the pictures of the earth taken from the moon. We do not need atomic bombs at all to uproot us. The uprooting of humanity is already here." And he's making again a strictly logical point. He's saying that which is the root now depends now depends for its existence the subject. the Cartesian subject and the Cartesian graph in order to be rendered as real in the essential sense. That's what he means. Okay, so this is the condition in which we are. The backyard of our house, where there might be a plant, and the earth itself are qualitatively the same things. They are different magnitudes, different ways, different measurement, but ultimately they are measured in the same way. They are but measurements, and the thing itself is but an illustration of that measurement, right? And this is what Heidegger says, especially in his lectures in Bremen and in Freiburg. He talks about the annihilation of the thing, that the thing, whether it's the earth or the snail which is walking in the backyard, is a mere illustration. What matters is what can be measured, right? He's also very fond of quoting Max Planck, who said, and he quotes this in his interview with the Buddhist monk, which is very famous. He says that Max Planck says that what is real is measurable. Okay. So that's our condition, and this condition has the metaphysical history that we spoke about, right? So this is a quotation from a wonderful essay in a very good book called Heidegger in the Global Age by Michael Marder, who says that the condition in which the world is in right now, and this is something he's reading from the Heidegger of the 1940s, late 1945, 1946, where Heidegger uses the term devastation or desertification. And what has happened here is that everything has become the same, and there is no sign of a boundary or a delimitation to where we are, right? For instance, in order to know that we are in the city of Bombay, for example, we need the boundary which separates this city from the next city, right? The other is a significant aspect in self-definition for the city. But what is happening with technology and its global devastation, if we were to go with Heidegger's metaphor from the 40s at least, and that metaphor is always relevant for him, what is happening is that there is no frame anymore. There is no limit to the known universe from where it could stop, and another qualitatively different reality could begin. All that is over. Everything is pretty much the same. And in philosophical terms, what that means, and we will see this further, just bear with these few slides because they use terms which will be explored and discussed. Philosophically, what is happening is that there is no longer any contingency. There is no longer any mystery which can shatter our epistemic paradigms. Everything is brought forth by technology into pure, what Michael Marder beautifully calls total translucence. Everything is brought to presence, right? Everything is brought to light. Okay. So this is the situation in which we are. And there is, and once we start looking at Heidegger's language now, it appears the things that we saw in the very beginning, the idea that metaphysics is purely European, all that sounds now like a critical point. It looks less Eurocentric and more critical. But even in that, of course, even in that negative way, it still is Eurocentric because it is claiming that this one history has transformed so much. But it would be very difficult to say that we are not implicated still in that history, given that technology is deterritorialized and technology is so global. Okay, so that's the sort of introduction to what we're going to talk about in terms of history and frameworks, boundaries, lines, all that. Okay, so What is Heidegger's understanding of history? This is the question that we're going to be dealing with. So Heidegger distinguishes between two things. One is history, which he understands in an ontological sense, which I've kept blank because that's the whole discussion. So we will be looking at that further. But he distinguishes that from historiography, which is the study of the past through empirical means, but more philosophically, seriously, what it means is to look at the past from the frame of the present, and that frame happens to be the empirical one, right? So it's to reckon and know the past, but to know the past through the frame of the present. So this is the basic distinction that he makes between ontological history and what we could call empirical history, right? History which studies the past from the perspective of the present. And these quotes have been taken from his his lectures from the late 30s, where he lectures on logic. Those are very interesting lectures. And I found this to be a basic starting point. So these were good quotes. Good, and he does a good job in distinguishing the two meanings of history over here. Okay, so the historiography, the empirical history, is fine. That's not what Heidegger is interested in. Heidegger's main interest is then history as epochal, right? History, which he later calls the history of being, is epochal. It goes in epochs, right? Now, it's very important to think about, to clarify what epoch means for Heidegger. And the word epoch comes from the word epoch or epochal that we are using comes from epoche, right? And epoche is one of the central epistemic methods of phenomenology, right? And this is a good definition of what epoche means, and I've taken it from Husserl's Cartesian Meditations. And there are 2-3 things which are important to keep in mind. The whole statement need not be read. What he's trying to say is we need to put out of play, right? We need to put out of play all the positions that we already assume towards the objective world, right? And through this putting out of play, through this parenthesizing, right? Parenthesizing or putting out of play of all the other possibilities that come from our empirical understanding of the objective world, we get to study the structures of the self, right? So that's the basic meaning of epoche, where we put all the other comportments out of play. They're not negated, they are not declared false, but they are rendered inactive or inapplicable for the moment till the analysis is over, right? So this is the understanding of epoche is central in understanding what Heidegger is trying to do with epochal history as epochs. Right? Now, what that means is, for Heidegger, history is the showing of a particular configuration of meaning for a particular time, right? So this is a definition from Ian Thompson's work, where he's saying that history of being is a history of different constellations of intelligibility, right? Different world formations. For example, in the medieval world, the constellation, the configuration of intelligibility revolves around a creator God and the cosmos as the created of God. And all the other meaning all the other comportments that we have towards beings in the world is informed by this framework, by this configuration, right? And entities within a particular configuration, within a particular constellation, within a particular frame, entities are comported with, understood as, or treated as how the framework or the constellation or configuration of intelligibility informs us, right? And for Heidegger, the history of metaphysics goes on like this in different epochal manifestations. You have history beginning with, say, the Greeks, and then you have the medievals, then or even before them you have the Neoplatonic time, then you have the medievals, and then you have modern philosophy, and then it goes on till the time of technological modernity, right? But there is something, so these are different formations, different worlds in which configuration of meanings appear, right? But there is something which is the same. There is something which is common to all these different epochal manifestations. And that is that they're all metaphysics for Heidegger. Okay. Now, we've been using the word epoch. Just remember the epoche that we just saw from the Cartesian meditations. What that means is, let's take the medieval period. So the medieval constellation of meaning, the medieval constellation of intelligibility, which is where you comport with beings within the framework of the creation, the created and creator. In this constellation, all the other constellations have to be put out for the moment, right? It has to bracket the other ones. And that is precisely what metaphysics does in its grounding, as we will just see in the coming slides. But just notice how the word epoche, the word epoch that we are using is related to epoche in phenomenology. That for a certain structure of meaning to prevail, it should bracket out the other structures of meaning, right? And what it is doing, this bracketing out or parenthesizing out, remains invisible. If it's made visible, then the whole game collapses. It has to be invisible. That's how it has its power, right? So that's basically how Heidegger understands the history of being. Now, this is just a list of this. Heidegger does this in the 4th volume to his Nietzsche lectures, and in other places as well, where he sort of gives lists for what being, which is this being as that which metaphysics studies, what are the names that this being has been given throughout history, right? And it's in these names, or through these names, that we get an idea of what the framework of a particular epoch is configured by or configured as. Okay. Now, this is the real stuff. This is where I think that one can get a better understanding of what Heidegger is trying to do. We have been looking at different quotations, and but let's try to see what all of that we just said could mean. Now, I understand this is just a way of thinking about this. This is something I call the bread loaf theory, where there is a loaf of bread, but it has been cut into different slices of bread. Okay, and a bread is a wonderful metaphor, because it's so for this, and it's so well designed to allow for this analogy to work. Now, each slice is a certain epoch, right? And you can notice over here on the left, I have just one slice of bread, where there is a framework of meaning, a world of meaning has been created, and it's framed in a particular way. And although it belongs to the same history, it is still cut from that, or it's still distant from that, right? So um, this uh, this is where we now, in a sense, understand what Heidegger was saying in that definition of his, where he was saying that historiography is the study of the past from the perspective of the present, right? So suppose you are this person who is standing on the left side in that loaf of bread. The whole toolkit of understanding that you have is informed by that particular framework, right? And in order for you to understand the first loaf of bread in this bag, the first, like at the very end, you cannot do it except from the frame in which you are standing, right? So that's what he means by historiography. Historiography can, when he says that understanding the past from the perspective of the present, he is trying to say that the past can only be brought within the current reigning epistemic paradigm, which has its own frame, right? Now, I like to call these the cuts that you can see into which the loaf has been divided into different slices. I like to call them punctuations, right? Because I also love the sort of grammatical metaphor, parenthesis, punctuation, and so on, right? But punctuation is useful because one of the things to keep in mind in this framework that we are seeing right here is that there is no teleology over here, right? The break of one particular frame and the birth of another is not destined in that sense, right? It happens through sudden shifts, certain decisions that are made, and Heidegger has a lot to say about decisions. And something happens all of a sudden, a radical contingency hits, and thereafter the current frame becomes visible. And as soon as it becomes visible, it loses its power to enforce meaning, as it were, right? And then it gets broken, and then a new frame of meaning is created, or a new world is formed, basically, right? So the history that we are talking about here is contingent. Now, I just would like to say a word or two about contingency. Contingency is where, although what happens is inherited, it is not necessary that this is the way it had to go, right? It's not necessary that this is the direction it would have taken. But once the direction has been taken, though the past is again sedimented into the present, right? Once the decision has been taken, then that's the path that is followed. But there is no prior necessity that it should go in this way, right? So that is a contingent history in Heidegger. So a world collapses essentially by its frames, by its framework becoming revealed. The whole game is of concealment and revealment, concealment and unconcealment in Heidegger. So world collapses by its frames becoming visible, and therefore losing its power to be taken on faith or to be taken seriously, as it were, and then a new framework is set and a new world emerges. That's how history goes. And you will notice how frame is such a central thing here. Okay, so that's that. I hope that is clear. This is Heidegger, who says again in his Bremen lectures, these lectures were given around 1949 to 1950, around that time. This, I think, was in 1949. Heidegger is saying that world, in its self-refusing worlding, remains concealed as the essential provenance of being. And now is the main important statement, says that yet world remains in concealment, lethe, in such a way that its concealment precisely affords an unconcealment. Right? So if we go back to the medieval example that we used, in order for beings to reveal themselves, there is a particular framework which governs that, but that framework itself cannot reveal. Otherwise, Heidegger uses a term in one of his lectures in 1929. It's called to be taken in. To be taken in. So, in order to be taken in into this play, as it were, the frame has to be hidden. The world and its contours have to be concealed. And its concealment is what allows for the unconcealment, aletheia, of beings and the particular meaning that beings hold for us. For example, Heidegger's example, when we go to a parking lot today, there are many cars that you can find parked. The very structure of the parking lot and our comportment towards that space implicitly regards those objects as something that should be immediately available, right? The availability of the cars, that's how the car's being manifests itself. And I like to think about this through the metaphor of the button. Everything has to be a switch, so everything has to be available, and that it's the availability is how beings reveal themselves to us in the age of technology. So, but that we are doing all this within a certain configuration of intelligibility remains concealed, and that is why we are so totally taken in by the world and the meaning formations that occur in the world. We're completely dissolved in that, like fish in water, as the common example goes. We are completely taken in. If we are not, we won't be able to comport with meaning. There has to be that element of concealment, right? So that's what that means. Now, so history happens, we saw, through epochal moments or epochal breaks, right? I like to think about that through a certain evolutionary metaphor, and especially that of punctuated equilibrium, which is a theory of evolution and how evolution happens, which is popularized by Stephen Jay Gould. Although I think it's paleontologists always knew about punctuated equilibrium, but I think he made it famous. So we don't need to really enter into the science, we just need to use the metaphor. And this is a very simple definition of punctuated equilibrium in Gould's work. So usually in evolutionary theory, the idea is that things constantly change. Right? This is commonly known as gradualism, that there is a constant, gradual, but constant and constant movement towards complexity. Punctuated equilibrium says rather that the fundamental point of evolution is stability. It's not movement. It's not gradual change, but rather the point is to remain the same. So this is the definition. He says that geologically abrupt appearance of change, geologically abrupt. So the change itself is contingent. It comes from geological movements, meteors collapsing with the earth in the case of dinosaurs, for example. And in this sudden shift, sudden geological break, there is a change, right? There is something that they call decimation, and there is death, and there is a new possibility that emerges. And the point of this new possibility is to then remain in stasis, in stability, right? This is a wonderful metaphor to understand Heidegger's understanding of history, because Heidegger also assumes, Heidegger also explains or explores history as sudden shifts that happen, sudden breaking of the frame that happens, and then, and by abrupt, for geology, abrupt means quick, it's temporal. For Heidegger, abrupt here would mean contingent, something that breaks the logic of the system, right? There's something that abruptly means it's not pre-programmed within the world itself, right? Because the world, in order for the world to function, the frame cannot reveal itself. So there has to be an alterity, an otherness, which abruptly brings the frame of the world to appearance, to unconcealment, to revealment, right? That's how abrupt has to be understood. And then the function of the next stage is to remain stable and conceal itself, right? This concealing is what allows it to be stable and to pull the strings invisibly, as it were, right? There's a wonderful thing Heidegger also says that I'm reminded of in Being and Time, in the introduction to Being and Time, which I have read multiple times and always missed, where Heidegger talks about science, and he says that the point of science, the way it shifts its paradigms, it would be wonderful to think Heidegger along with Kuhn in this context, but the point is the shifts of science happen through crises. And he says they are imminent crises. Crises happen within that, right? And then things become unstable, right? The presuppositions become revealed. The things that were assumed in advance, supposed in advance, become kind of revealed. And then the magic is gone. And then a new paradigm must emerge. In a sense, history works in that way. Okay. Now, how does all this happen? Okay, before that, is there anything that anybody wants to add or, say? Okay, then I'll continue. Now the question is, how are the frames, the world of meaning, how is it kept in place? And what does it mean to keep this thing in place? Right? How is a particular world maintained? Right? And here is where Heidegger talks about metaphysics as ontotheology. This also, in general, Heidegger's understanding of metaphysics is that it is ontotheological. And ontotheology is a concept which needs to be explored. It's difficult, and But there is good work now. For instance, Ian Thompson, who I have already quoted, referred to before, has written two wonderful texts on this, and I think he is the current best exponent of Heidegger's ontotheology. In the Heidegger lexicon, also, which is edited by Mark Rathall, I think ontotheology is explained by him, defined by him. Um, but we also have Heidegger's own definition of ontotheology, which I have with me here. So, but what we are trying to look at is, and what we have been seeing so far is that there are different epochs. Every epoch has a certain frame, and that frame hides itself as a frame. It hides itself, and it through its hiding, it allows for the unconcealment of beings to take place. And when he's saying unconcealment, it means it allows a certain meaning to be given to beings. So in the medieval epoch, beings are creations of God, maybe even expressions of God. In the technological one, beings are resources. They don't. Being itself is just a thing has no relevance. Its relevance only exists so far as we think of it as usable resource. Is there a comment? I can't see or hear anything.
Are you are you sure to take leave? So he was just
Okay.
informing about that.
Okay. Okay.
Bharatwaj, this is going fine. Means, can you please just make it more? Means, for example, just one more example.
Yeah. Tell
Means,
me. Tell me. Yeah.
about when are you saying means through this point that how technology and theology are coming up here.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, in this framing means how what's the difference in do you mean that because when frames hide themselves, then it gives certain point to make meaning. Means in
Yes.
hiding there is a meaning making, right?
Yeah.
So then
Yeah.
how that worked in theology and how it's working in technology? Just that point. Just make few more distinctions about that.
Yeah. For example, in if the guiding frame of our particular world says that things, see, it's all about how entities are understood, right? How individual things and the world and their context and their relationships are understood. So, in a theological frame, the meaning of an entity has a particular meaning. Every entity is created by God, let's say, and therefore um, every entity reflects God's wisdom, for example. And so my behavior with entities, my comportment towards entities has a certain qualitative difference. There's a certain I treat entities in a certain way. So um, if I understand, for example, that a mountain is God itself, let's say, in a certain context, then my attitude towards the meaning that the mountain will shine forth is that of a holy place, a place of um, sacred meaning, or you know. But if yeah, but if my framework is that of technology and technological enframing, which I will come to in a moment, then that mountain becomes not a sacred space which I worshipfully engage with, but it becomes a mine for minerals, a resource from which I can grab as much as I want. So the mountain's meaning itself loses. It's the mountain's point is only so that it can give resources, right? And Heidegger has a term for that called Bestand, which is that we look at everything as stockpiles, everything as resource.
Okay.
Um, yeah, everything as resource, right?
Yes. Okay. Fine. Fine. Just
But
as.
if we know and this is again something Heidegger. It's not a contradiction in Heidegger, but it's the danger of technology, and we will come to that. But the point is that once we know that the frame determines this, the frame's power loses its, its influence, right? And it's something that, for example, Nietzsche says that certain truths were accepted because they had value, because they were useful. For example, suppose to believe in something, to believe in, let's say, God, um, makes me live a wonderful life. I get up early in the morning, I go to bed on time, I'm very disciplined, I take care of my body as the temple of the divine. So Nietzsche's explanation there, and it's all coming from him, in fact, is that because it was useful, and Nietzsche is also immensely influenced by Darwin in his understanding of Darwin. He will say that because it's useful, because it leads to preservation, it becomes a truth because of its utility, right? And I have a quotation from Nietzsche after a few slides which explains this. Now, if I know that is why I'm believing in God, if I know that framework, if I know that, I only believe in this thing because it is useful, or I only believe in this thing because it makes me get up early, or whatever, if I know that that's why it is, then its power is lost. Then it becomes an artificial thing. Then that framework has lost its power. That kind of would that be helpful?
Yes, good. Yes, it's clear.
Okay. Yeah. So the frames have to be maintained. The frames have to be in place. And this whole story that we have been talking about right now, the story of the epochal manifestness of being in history. This story, and being as this happening of history, is something that metaphysics does not talk about, Heidegger says. Heidegger begins his Being and Time by saying that metaphysics always forgets to raise the question of being, right? Which seems like an odd accusation, because it appears that metaphysics does nothing else but raise the question of being. But what Heidegger is talking about, and this will become clear as we see this slide, what Heidegger is talking about is what we have been talking about, the concealment, unconcealment process of being. That's what metaphysics does not think about. And Heidegger says in his, again, in his lectures on Nietzsche, Heidegger says that metaphysics can never think about that. Because if it does, its job is to maintain the frames that we are looking at right now. But if it knows the full sort of story, the power of its power loses. We will see this right now. So there are two meanings to ontotheology, ontology and theology. Ontology studies entities, each and every being, in terms of the most common shared essence that they have, right? The most common shared essence that they have, that is ontology. So the string theory's ontology would be that everything's intelligibility, everything's meaning is grounded on what is happening with the strings. You see? So everything is grounded in that primordial, basic. So Thales, for example, is the first sort of ontology, that each and everything is different, but This variety is grounded in one shared essence, which for Thales is water. For a string theorist, it would be strings, let's say, right? So this, Ian Thompson calls this the ground up explanation. Ontology is ground up. Theology, ontology is inside out. Ground up, inside out. Theology is outside in. It grounds the meaning of entities in a supreme being. All beings are grounded. Their meaning is understood on the basis of a supreme example of being, a supreme concept of being, a supreme, for example, for Nietzsche, it could be power, for example. For Thomas Aquinas, it's God himself, right? And so on and so forth. So you see every slice of bread, and the frame that the slice of bread has is what is happening with that frame is that all the beings within the slice of bread are being grounded in these two ways, ontologically and theologically, right? Let's take somebody like Nietzsche, and let's say that there is a modern frame that he has set up. Let's say all the entities in his world are first explained by the will to power, that there is a force which is the meaning of everything, and then all entities are, they are all eternally recurring things, stuff which eternally recur, right? So that his ontotheology would be will to power as eternal recurrence. Okay, if we take someone like Thomas Aquinas, his ontology would be that things are essences, they are quiddities in Latin, in that scholastic metaphysics, that each and every thing is grounded on essences of those things, and the principle which sustains it is God, right? That's how that frame is being generated, right? The frame is being generated by these two methods, ontology and theology, right? So that's what metaphysics does. And metaphysics does this epochally. Every epoch does its ontology and theology in a different way, but all of them ground. They all do the job of grounding and explaining the intelligibility of things, right? So each epoch ontologically and theologically grounds beings, and that's what that frame does. So in Aquinas's ontotheology, entities will be encountered in a certain way, right? They'll be grounded in God. So there's a certain meaning that entities will have, right? So that's what metaphysics does. The bigger story, which Heidegger is telling us, this metaphysics cannot think, because once it does, this individual epochal grounding will be impossible for it. Right. So what happens, and this is again the Ian Thompson that I mentioned. I think we have already spoken about this in the previous slide. What happens with this, with ontotheology, is that when it creates one particular frame, the excess, right? The additional frames which could be created have to have an epoche, have to be parenthesized. Otherwise, no frame can be created, Yeah, that's what it means. And Ian Thompson puts this well by saying that through through ontotheology, each epoch stops or holds the floodwaters of the other histories, other historicities other epochs that could rush into this one, right? So that's what this does. Now, Heidegger also maintains, and this is again all the way from Nietzsche, and we'll wrap this up after this, and then I'll say something about technology, and we will stop. Um, there is an essential nihilism to all this, right? Now, it's important to keep in mind, or to think about, or to think about what nihilism is, right? Now, this something about Nietzsche we just talked about, and what we said about Nietzsche was that he said, for example, that um, truth depends on certain things that have nothing to do with truth. For example, we said that if we believe in X, if we believe in a God, for example, um, we can have a good life. We'll get up early. We will live healthily. So if you notice, the truth as the ultimate value is not the point of that truth. The point of accepting that truth is these other things to do with utility, preservation, and so on and so forth, right? And that's the historical sense of nihilism that both Nietzsche and Heidegger are talking about. Now, this is a very wonderful passage from Nietzsche, which is from the early Nietzsche, which is Truth and Lie in an Extramoral Sense. That's the essay, where this is one of the most wonderful lines of intellectual history, actually. This is where all the seeds of later deconstruction and so on is sowed. It says that truth is a mobile army of metaphor, metonyms, anthropomorphisms, right? We talked about human benefits, or those things, preservation instinct and so on. In short, a sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm and canonical and obligatory to a people, right? So that's the nihilistic essence which it is talking about. Nihilism is not in any sense understood in an immoral sense, or in something negative. What is being said is, in order for a particular truth structure to be preserved, all the other excess possibilities that history contains will have to be blocked for a while, right? Which means that this particular framework of truth that we have is not the full story, but it doesn't matter, right? It has to block all the other possibilities, otherwise no possibility will reveal itself, right? That's nihilistic, because historically, the truth of being, the full truth of being in all its abundance, has to be forgotten in order for one particular world frame to be grounded, right? So that's the nihilistic sort of essence which metaphysics contains. This is taken from the 4th volume of Heidegger's Nietzsche lectures. Very important passage where Heidegger again says something. We've seen this with his 1949 lecture as well, where Heidegger is saying, being itself occurs essentially as the unconcealment in which being comes to presence. Something has to be brought into being, but for that, something else has to happen, which is unconcealment itself remains concealed. right? The process by which meaning is generated will have to be hidden. That's all he's saying, right? In order for the process of meaning to work, the process by which it is all happening, the framework within which it is all happening will have to be hidden, which have to be, you have to hide that, right? And in order for this history to take place, in order for this movement to take place, being, Heidegger's understanding of being, the non-metaphysical understanding of being, that being cannot be cited. If it is seen, if it is understood, then this metaphysical framework will not work. And we can see the after Heidegger and through deconstruction, post-structuralism, and so on, the same metaphysical confidence is lost because we can see the fuller story. And once we see that story, we cannot be confident with that individual frame which metaphysics had. Now, this probably is my second last slide, but it's very important. It's a chair, and what I'm asking you to look at is how, in order for you to see this chair, in order for this chair to show itself to you, an aspect of the chair has to be hidden, right? And this is phenomenology, Husserl. The aspect of the chair which is revealing itself to you, that which you can see in front of you, depends on another aspect which is in the shadow, which is hidden, right? In order for the full plenitude of this chair to come to you, you will have to walk around it, right? It cannot show itself to you at once, then it won't be a chair. Right now, you're seeing the frame logic that we've been struggling with just in the previous slides. So, and artists know this, game developers know this, that the main way to reveal an art object is by shading, is by hiding, right? And this is why, to Heidegger, art is the way to understand this concealment, unconcealment logic that we have been struggling with so much. So for this chair to show itself, a part of the chair needs to be hidden, and that already opens up a history, because then you have to walk around that chair, right? And once you walk around that chair to the other side, this side of the chair will become hidden, right? Already you can see aspects of the chair revealing itself in short episodes. If you could snapshot, if you can take a camera and you can click pictures of each aspect of the chair as you move around it, you will see an epochal, historical unfoldment. I hope this is clear, because it's a very interesting connection to how phenomenology is so central to thinking about history in Heidegger, right? Okay, now this is pretty much the final part. This, and I think this is it. With technology, however, Heidegger claims that something happens in the history of thought which is new. With technology, what happens is, and I can really throw this up for discussion even, maybe I'll not go on into it too much. Maybe I could break here and we can start with the discussion. But according to Heidegger, with technology, what happens is that the frame itself assumes predominance. The frame itself becomes the entity, right? And if you are interested in Marshall McLuhan, this aspect of Heidegger is wonderfully brought forward in the idea of the medium itself becomes the message, and that's a double danger um, because now, if the frame is the entity, what is now the frame? There is no more frame. The unframing is the frame. So that's the wonderful complexity which Heidegger engages with in technology. Um, so if we understand the frame in the context of, let's say, uh, a cage, think of this cage as an environment, right? The frame allows you, delimits the meaning possibilities of the entity within. So in the first case, you have the frame, and inside there is an entity. The frame delimits the possible meanings and the comportments that you can have with this entity. But with modernity and techno-scientific modernity, and we should remember that quote which we saw in the very beginning from Michael Marder about the unframed framing, right? With modernity, what happens is that the environment itself becomes the entity or the artifact. Marshall McLuhan used the word artifact. The environment itself becomes, now it's so inescapable. So if we notice, and this is something that Ian Thompson also talks about in one of the texts that I mentioned, if you notice, modern philosophy largely is talking about frames, structures, right? But what is enframing this discussion and engagement with frames is the hidden thing we do not know, right? And so that's what happens with technology. It's an unframed frame. It's a frameless frame, right? Heidegger also uses the term absence becomes presence, things like that. But technology's greatest problem for Heidegger is that with technology, a radical alterity becomes impossible. Because if there is no delimitation, there is nothing that can break the frame, right? We talked about Bombay, right? So Bombay is delimited by its boundaries. And there is a city besides Bombay. There is a state which surrounds Bombay, right? So you can understand what Bombay is because there are others. There is alterity, which helps you understand your city. If you did not have those boundaries, like the universe doesn't have boundaries, so where are we? There is no answer to questions like that, right? So what happens with technological modernity of enframing, where the frame becomes the artifact, or the environment becomes the artifact, to use a Marshall McLuhan formulation, what becomes impossible is otherness. Innate surprise becomes impossible. There is really nothing that's going to surprise us, even if we think about astronomically. Yes, we will discover new planets. Maybe we will discover new forms of life. We are still going to understand those forms of life through Darwinian natural selection. We are still going to understand the new planets through the measurements that we already have. So the question arises, where is the other in a frameless and framed world? And I believe, and I'll stop, I believe that for Heidegger, this is the central problem. And he constantly, in my understanding, he's in a constant search for alterity. He's in a constant search for alterity, but the boundary line, the boundary, the limit where the other can enter in from, always is deferred, always recedes, right? And that's the reach of global devastation, global techno-scientific modernity, and so on, right? This one quotation from him, and he's talking about technological enframing, saying that it reveals whatever does not bring itself forth and does not yet lie here before us. Everything is translucent. Everything is revealed, including that which always concealed itself, which is the framework. That also is revealed. So, what is missing, and Heidegger says this in other contexts as well, what is missing is genuine mystery. There is no mystery, there is no genuine crisis of the present paradigm, right? So there is an end with global technological modernity of punctuations, rifts, contingency, otherness, right? And if we think about just end this, if we think about the first slide which we saw Levinas talking about the other. Although Levinas is to me intuitively I can see where he is wrong. He is wrong, but we should not celebrate the victory too quickly, you know. And yeah, and so boundaries, technology being this is where we are at, and yeah. So I think that would do.